listening to episode 18, chapter 5 of the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. I'm Chris Lamberth.
And I'm Josh Havens. We're on a journey to learn what it means to live a lifestyle of discipleship. We're glad you're joining us and hope that as you set aside this time for God, that He will help you grow today in the everyday moments of life.
Today, we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Leo Sanchez. Leo Sanchez is the Werner R. H. and Elizabeth R. Krause Professor of Hispanic Ministries at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. A faculty member since 2004, he is Professor of Systematic Theology and Director of the seminary's Center for Hispanic Studies. He received his Doctorate of Philosophy from Concordia Seminary and his Master of Divinity from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He holds a bachelor's degree from Concordia University, Wisconsin in Mequon. Leo teaches regularly in the United States and abroad, and he has delivered courses and workshops in Brazil, Cuba, India, Ghana, Chile, Panama, Argentina, and Venezuela. He has participated in various colloquies on pedagogy through the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion. In his community, Leo is principal double bass player with the St. Louis Civic Orchestra. He also enjoys swimming and international cooking. He and his wife, Tracy Lynn, have two children, Lucas Antonio and Anna Victoria.
You probably don't think of sleep and rest as a spiritual discipline. But when you look at the life of Christ as a model for the way you live today, you have to take into account the times he got away from the crowds, rested, and slept. He even took a nap on a boat ride one night in the middle of a storm. And rest like this is a way of learning to trust God. It means giving up your control over your time and letting go of the never-ending list of things to do. In this final chapter of our conversation with Leo, he explores the devotional model of sanctification and how valuable it is for us to rest and celebrate as we become more like Jesus.
So last one, the devotional model. I really see this, you can correct it if it's wrong, but I really see this, we've been building on each one of these models, and then I feel like the devotional model comes in and it sort of encompasses them all in a way, sort of like the renewal model does, and I feel like it has to be the beginning, but the devotional model then sort of says, like, this is the rhythm, this is the movement of our entire life, and so we begin to, everything that we work and rest in, and so explain to us a little bit what the devotional model is all about.
Yeah, so the devotional model is about living according to the rhythm of life into which God has placed us as His creatures, right? And that rhythm of life includes both movement and repose. It includes labor. It includes rest. And we have this already in the Garden of Eden, even before the fall. We have the creation of the day, and there was evening and there was morning. And this is before we were even created. This is before Adam and Eve even come into play. In other words, we have no say on this, This is simply the rhythm that God has established for human life and for all of life, but also for human life. And then you see the same thing, in that Adam is placed in the garden, right? And so to be a steward of creation and so on. And at the same time, God rests on the seventh day. And so there is a moment also to stand still and rejoice in all that is good which God has made. And then in the life of Israel, you see that pattern of the sabbatical cycles, right? And they were both to recognize God's gift of creation and to recognize God's deliverance of His people from bondage to Egypt. So it was also to rejoice in His salvation. And the idea was that, life is about labor in God's earth and being stewards of God's earth, but also it's about taking the time to stand still and rejoice in all of His gifts. And that's more the spiritual sense of the Sabbath, of prayer and praise, and even play, and also, as we know, literal rest. And so what I wanted to show was that in Jesus' own life, we see this pattern at work. Because again, Jesus lives humanly according to what it means to be truly, um, uh, in God's creation, which means, that he lives a life of prayer. He lives a life of work. He's certainly very busy. But I find it compelling, for instance, that even though he's busy and the crowds want him to do stuff for him, all of a sudden he'll take time to go to the mountain and pray. And it's like, really? Jesus, shouldn't you be busy? Like, shouldn't you be helping people all the time? But no, he's praying on the mountain, or he falls asleep on the boat, wake up, So I think in some ways, this is also a life in the Spirit, the Spirit hovers over the waters. He brings about this design. Jesus lives fully according to this design. And we're invited by the same Spirit to be shaped after Christ's own life. And I think in a society that struggles so much with burnout, both church leaders and laity, it's important to be reminded of the need for Sabbath. And that is part of what it means to grow spiritually too. Since I've been talking about Luther a number of times, and part of the reason I bring Martin Luther in the book is because I was writing this close to the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. But there's a time when he talks about how just going to bed, just literally sleeping, is the greatest act of worship, he said. And one might be offended at that. What do you mean the greatest act of worship? The greatest act of worship is for me to get busy doing the Lord's business. That's the greatest act. And he says, no, it's just to actually go to bed. Because when you sleep, you're actually embodying an act of faith and trust that God has the whole wide world in his hands, and that, God will take care of things. That the world does not depend on you to run. And that is the greatest act of worship sometimes, just to, rest literally in the Lord, So
I tried telling my boss that one time. It didn't work as well. No, I love that. And I can speak for Josh on this one as well. We have been very challenged of late, is to take this one seriously, because you're right. We want to just push that. Oh, I'll rest later. It's not that important. And so bringing this model of rest and understanding that that's the rhythm that God has created into our lives as an act of the Spirit just totally reframes things. We become like Christ even when we lay our heads down to rest or to withdraw from the crowds and to be alone with our Father the way that he did.
Yeah, I will say we also confuse leisure with rest a lot.
We
think that if we're out doing something fun or at a party with family and friends, that's rest because we're not working, but really that's not the kind of rest all the time that we need.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do need to be a little more like Jesus and go off by ourselves and be alone for a while.
Yeah, so in this model, what I encourage people to do is to find their mountain. What's your mountain? And I also ask people to remember, remember that life is not always about attending to the crowds. So what are the crowds in your life? The crowds they come to us in the form of cell phone, texts, right? They come to us in the form of Facebook and so on and so forth, right? So find yourself your mountain. What does that look like for you? And there is a certain growth that goes into that pattern of life. One has to be aware, of those things that sort of get in the way of sabbatical. What is that? Yeah.
Well, Leo, thank you so much for covering these 5 models. You have an 8th chapter where you try to put all these 5 models into a story that you would really like to see the North American church get. So a big ask for you, but like if you could summarize it relatively quickly, you could take your time, but I want to be sensitive to your time. Is what message do you hope to impart to the North American church? Like, what do you want your readers to come away from this book with?
Well, I think there is kind of there are two aspects to this. One is the book was written really for the church, so that they might discern the Spirit in their lives, so that they might discern what their spiritual needs are. Each of these models of the Christian life deal with particular needs, right? So the sacrificial model, the need for meaning and purpose, and how do I serve my neighbor, the last one we talked about, the devotional model, the need for rest in a busy world, this kind of stuff. So one is discernment in the church, so that we might grow spiritually, and I wrote it for that reason primarily. But then I also said, when you look at the research on spirituality in North America, there's a lot of spiritual hunger. People describe what their spiritual needs are, and sometimes they involve things like the need for rest in a busy world, the need for meaning, purpose in life. So what I'm saying is this: what if we were to embody these models in such a way that it invites people with spiritual questions out there, people with spiritual hunger, into conversations about the spiritual life? So I wanted it to be sort of a way that sanctification could also missionally engage neighbors seeking for a spiritual life, to see if that embodiment might bring us into dialogue with them, and perhaps even into inviting them to share in this kind of life. So it's kind of a concern for missions, but from the side, not so much in terms of proclamation, but more in terms of kind of in the early church, where people looked at Christians and said things like, look at how they love each other, right? Maybe there is something there, and we want to learn more.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love it. And it really is a way of taking the life of Jesus seriously, and it gives so much hope that the way that he lived can actually be lived through us, through the power of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate your work. I thank you for this. I think everybody needs to go and check out this book. You deal with some incredible material, but it is very accessible. So where can people go to find out more about you, your work, and to get a copy of the book?
Yeah, so you can always find things that I have written at concordiatheology.org, concordiatheology.org. And so over the years, I have written several theological pieces, and you'll find videos and so on. This is the blog, the website of the faculty of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, where I work. So you'll find a few things there from me if you look, search for the name. And then the book and other things that I have written, you can find in Amazon. There you probably have to look under the fuller name, Leopoldo Sánchez. And you'll find a number of things I have written there, both on the Spirit and also on issues related to immigrant neighbors, which is another area that I write in. So that's where you can find a little bit about Leo Sanchez.
Sounds good. And as always, we will have links to everything in the show notes. So if you can't remember what the URL is, you can just click on the link in the show notes and it'll take you right to it. So, Leo, again, thank you so much for your time and for being with us today. This has been so helpful, and we really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. And may the Holy Spirit continue to sculpt our lives so that we might reflect the life of Jesus, both in our churches, but also out in the world.
I'm challenged by each of the 5 models of sanctification that Leo has shared with us this week. They each have their own unique way of approaching the life we are to live in the Spirit, and they each challenge me personally in different ways. But what I'm left thinking after this conversation is that the mark of a disciple's life should be one that looks like the life of Jesus. When people look at us, they shouldn't just see a mom or a dad, a businessman or a plumber. They should see a disciple of Christ who walks in joy because they are forgiven, whose life is part of something greater than the mundane of the day, who serves their neighbor, who loves and cares for the marginalized, and who have devoted their lives to the pursuit of Christ in everything they do. And when people see disciples like these, they will ask, "How do you do it?" And we will tell them about the one whom we follow and the Holy Spirit who dwells within us, empowering us to live just as Christ did.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. To find out more about Leo Sanchez and his work, check out concordiatheology.org. Then be sure to pick up a copy of Leo's book, The Sculptor's Spirit. If you want to stay up to date on everything happening at Daily Growth Discipleship, go to dailygrowthdiscipleship.com and subscribe for free. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.